So I wondered whether anyone had a response or a question to start with. Immediate reactions to what Laura offered us.
Well, I was first.
I was kind of thinking about the difference between attention and absorption, and I mean, there seems like a clear difference, especially between the kind of that spotlight view of attention and the way that you can become absorbed in, especially a physical task or a task that involves more of the being than just, say, being absorbed in reading or being absorbed in a game or something. I wanted to say a bit more about that actually, about sort of this kind of whole body attention you can have when you're, I don't know, making something.
Sorry, I'm slightly.
I'm trying to be absorbed.
Movement toward.
Yeah, it's a good, because I think there's definitely a correlation of associations with the terms attention and absorption, aren't there? That kind of, but it tends to be the notion of absorption presumes an exclusion of other things, that if by being absorbed in one thing we are necessarily not paying attention to something else, that we're cutting out or isolating or selecting a particular activity kind of at the expense of others. I mean, I guess that the use of the word immediately makes you think of absorption and theatricality. So, I guess it could sort of come into the kind of immanent mode of attention that I was talking about in terms of this idea of a kind of immersion in movement. So if theatricality was that kind of transcendent standing outside of something, that absorption or immersion could be a more immanent mode of attention that wasn't maintaining that kind of subject-object distinction that I was sort of arguing that Bergson and Capra are trying to get away from. But I'm noticing while I'm saying this, and I'm sure I was doing this in the talk as well, it shouldn't be that those modes sound like a binary, because I think you go through those tendencies towards representation and tendencies towards a more immanent relation to something all the time while you're going through a process. That you might have moments in, or maybe it is just a moment within the studio where you later reflect, oh yeah, actually maybe that was it. I have a felt memory of that was the moment where there was a different relationship happening there. But at other times I was too self-conscious, I was reflecting on myself while I was doing it, or so I don't mean to suggest that there's somehow, you can just be in sort of immanent attention, otherwise you're doing something wrong, this terrible standing outside of things or shining a spotlight on them. I think we're constantly oscillating between these different kinds of tendencies, I guess. So it was about kind of just questioning any fixing of the definition of attention. We think we know what it is, it's this, and equally that we think we know what we need to do in order to kind of solve this so-called crisis of attention. It's just about trying a bit harder, or whatever, switching off your mobile, or which seemed to be kind of suggested a little bit by some of the literatures I was looking at, that it's somehow a question of conscious effort that we're talking about in order to fight the internet, which is presented as the kind of the great enemy. So I guess that's kind of where I was going a little bit at the end, in thinking about, well, what does this mean for what we actually do as artists, as practitioners? Because I was sort of aware that some of the Bergsonian stuff sounds a bit like, well, we don't do anything. There's a kind of withdrawal going on there. But as I was trying to say at the end, I don't think that's what it is, but it's about what a certain kind of passive doing might be, or trying to put those sort of contradictory things together. Kind of how do you author unintentionally, or the contradiction that's in Cage's work, that's in Capra's work, all of those things.
keep talking about attention as a thing rather than as a verb.
To attend.
And I
Yeah.
suppose we talk many of the practices that we're involved in really deal with it as a verb, or as a, and I'm just wondering about that it's always reduced to a something rather than a certain kind of doing or being or
Yeah.
an actioning of a certain kind.
Yeah, I mean, and I guess more broadly, the kind of philosophy I sign up to, everything is a verb.
Yeah.
So there's kind of, yeah, there is, it's attending, it's bodying, it's, you know, everything is processual, and the problem with kind of the habitual mode of relationship is this tendency to petrify, to immobilize, to thingify things that are always in process. So not, yeah. So when I say attention, I am meaning attending, yeah. But yeah, Frassini was saying, but I guess this sort of, it's something that you've all been dealing with as well in terms of sort of process-product relationship, how when you're trying to stay in process, you don't end up turning process into an object in itself, that you kind of want to say, here we are showcasing our process, or inviting people in to see our process, that we just end up somehow objectifying it. It's very difficult to allow that fluidity, that movement to be seen. If that makes sense.
I had a moment, I've been living here for the last few days as well, and I had a moment this morning which was really highlighted by what you talked about in terms of how we might attend to something differently given the kind of the sort of model that you were talking about in the last part of the discussion. I had a moment this morning where I woke up and we've been working with this kind of in this different time almost, or we have time that we might not usually think that we have, although there's no more hours in the day. And I had a moment where I came downstairs and somebody else who was working in the building was sleeping on the ground floor, and I came down and she woke up and we had a conversation, and I recognised that you said something near the end, but which is by sensing when the life of something catches our attention, and I recognised what I need to sense or source what the life of a thing or a person or a moment is time. And then you spoke, and then I realised that I haven't been on my computer, but not because I mustn't go on my computer, but because actually I've been busy paying attention in a different way, a new way of thinking about time. So I haven't had time to busy myself with those faster, speedier things, and that's given me time to have a relationship with other people and myself differently.
I think, yeah, there's something about the adjustment to communal living that can be a great sensing of durations kind of rubbing up against each other. You're suddenly aware of your speed in relation to others, of kind of, is he still in the bathroom? That kind of, or whatever it is, that kind of, we can encounter it as impatience, of having to wait or whatever it is, but it's that process is a kind of feeling of different speeds, isn't it? That you've been doing here as part of your work. I don't know, maybe that's.
I wanted to ask you a question about knowledge and learning. If I wrote this down correctly, you spoke about the effect of sudden dissociation. Was that the phrase?
Yeah, that's from a quote from Bergson. That's what knowledge is.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I was wondering how else could learning happen if it starts to include what you described as maybe inefficient or not as aimless and maybe seemingly unproductive processes.
Yeah, it's the it's the part when I start saying things that people won't like about practices research and some of those kind of things, because I think a lot of what I'm interested in here is about not knowing and unknowing, and a kind of I guess a validation of those activities that we shouldn't that the type of thinking that practice does shouldn't always need to be brought onto the level of conscious knowledge in the way that we're kind of required to do, or at least it feels like that you're required to do through practices research. That this kind of requirement to explicate what you know in discourse versus a kind of this is a contradiction in terms, but a kind of felt knowing that you don't know. This kind of a felt openness that you have when you're making something that becomes that you kind of betray, or you can betray when you start to rivet it to kind of existing categories. So when we've been talking about this sort of idea of reversing the way that thought goes, that it should be something that kind of is forced on you by something that by definition you can't categorize or you can't fix according to existing definitions because it's new. It's not something you recognize, you can frame according to your existing ways of thinking about things. So it should be learning. That process is learning, but that it can't be framed as a kind of the production of knowledge, which we keep being forced into as if that were the only way of thinking about learning and research, that unless you're producing knowledge, whatever the hell that is, or however the hell you identify that it's somehow not valuable, or the practice isn't valuable unless it's producing knowledge, or it's not new unless it's producing knowledge. So I guess it's part of a kind of issue I have with the way that the way that the notion of practices research, I just find it a restrictive way of thinking about how practice thinks, the type of thinking or the type of learning that practices are involved in. But it becomes too goal-oriented too easily, it becomes too knowledge product-oriented.
It's quite interesting to replace the notion of knowledge in that context with insights. So you're not producing knowledge, but you're seeking insights, and therefore if you even if it's only you who get some kind of insight, but often you can share that. And I think that's a more productive way of thinking about it.
Yeah, and it may also be to do with how it's being shared, isn't it? That there are ways of sharing your experience that aren't about kind of retrapping something in a discourse that feels like it's a betrayal, but there are ways of, as you've been doing here, of sharing practices that don't involve that. So I'm being, I'm being unfair. It's more the way that kind of explanatory text, I guess, is still required of a lot of practices research. That seems kind of problematic to me. That we still can't yet have PhDs that don't involve huge written components. Like what?
Well, we're getting this.
We're getting there, but
we're getting there.
why is that still?
Because Brad Haseman very, very strongly advocates that the works that you make are in fact that's what you've made, that's the knowledge that you've produced, and it's within it.
But it seems so much still this anxiety about kind of
Proving it.
how do we judge those things?
But I'm thinking about how this is a problem of how we know socially too, of how we socialise, of how we converse outside of the academy, and I wonder if there's something of pleasure in a lot of the conversations we have that involve kind of figuring out of what's happening, and I'm thinking particularly of, again, there's someone else who's been living in this building for the last few days, and we've had a lot of conversation about partly about what we're doing, partly about what happens when the public comes in and what that does to what we're doing, and partly, as you acknowledge, whether there's evidence available, but the evidence is problematic because it seems to become representational in a way that's far too heavy. And there was a part of a conversation. Some of us were up late last night talking about the kind of shifts in experience as shifts in how we attend to each other, between the sitting in a circle and talking in the studio, or working together physically in the stairway, and or sitting and having a meal together. And the thing of the meal, for me, has felt quite an important thing for the particular. We attended to each other very differently in those occasions when we were eating together, but that would always bring a difficulty in terms of understanding those of you who visited us this afternoon as members of the public coming in, and that we could not feed you on all of those occasions, but we also didn't want to be observed eating and attending to each other in the way that we do when we eat, and we didn't want to turn into a zoo. But so this discussion that we'd had last night was really about these many different textual experiences of attending to and attending with each other as relational experiences, that we derive some pleasure in discussing them and exploring them further, and often that happens through words, and often that happens through other forms as well. And I'm not really sure where I'm going with this. Just that there's something in a sense of immersion in the experience I've had here, but there's also something in this a process of naming, of getting to know that experience of immersion in a different way by revisiting it through a conversation about it, which might also be a physical conversation.
Yes.
There's two things maybe. One is about the kind of where I was going towards the end, about the question of, well, how much is it? Is the question about the thing that the activity that you're involved in, and how much is it a question of how you're attending to the activity that you're involved in? So I don't think we should be rareifying any particular kind of formation of an activity as good or bad, let's say. So, a bunch of people sitting still while I'm standing up and talking as bad versus, people sitting around and eating together as good or whatever. But that there are kind of, there are processes of attending that create different experiences in both of those kind of formations, so that there would be, as you say, there would be a way of turning the dinner into a kind of, it's the animals at the zoo scenario, and equally of turning the talk into a participatory experience. There's always that possibility, it seems, that to go more in one tendency than another one. And I guess that's sort of what I've tried to write about in the Theatres of Immanence book as well, that kind of it's not about looking for forms as kind of right or wrong ways of trying to establish an immanent relationship to an audience, let's say. There is no form that's going to guarantee that or prohibit it entirely. And yet, obviously, looking at someone like CapPro, the interest has been there in, okay, well, how do we produce that unrecognisable thing? Is that a contradiction in terms, as artists, to try and produce an unrecognisable thing that will prompt embodied attention in the audience? Is that just kind of, it's like trying to, whatever, it's like chance processes in Cage. It's intending chance that you can't. It doesn't make sense to do that. Or you think you're escaping intention and you're not. You're just replacing it with intended chance. So that tension really interests me. That kind of authoring the unauthored, if you like. And the second thing is what you were saying, I think, about language. So I don't want to come across as kind of anti-language. I mean, although there are bits of Bergson where he sounds like he is a bit anti-language, as language is necessarily kind of a freezing of movement. It's always about capturing and stilling, and therefore a bad thing. But as you say, it's maybe more about a kind of a processual account where it's, the sort of the constant opening out of terminology that we think we know or understand, or we want to restrict to any given definition. That there's a kind of important performance going on in producing a new use of the word attention in a given context. So it's not that I kind of want to pin down the definition of attention. It means only this and this alone. But it's sort of, okay, what does it do for you right now if I talk about attention in this way rather than that way? So it's something about having a kind of more mobile use of language, isn't it?
Yeah, and I guess what made me think of is these experiences we've had of discussion in relation to other experiences or preceding experiences, and the possibility of that moment of naming is just something that we're passing through.
Yeah.
And that there may be pleasures associated with it, but they're temporary and they're part of this processual experience.
Well, and that hopefully, language is also a part of what you do as dance makers, that you're not, silently standing around. That there are those ways of using language that draw our attention to the processes in language, or language as a process rather than an object as well. What do those look like? How do you do that?
The talking is bringing me to this idea of attention and body memory, and coming back to the verb and body and dancing, and how much about dance has been about learning codes of movement, where often I think what happens is that here and now attention is replaced by a kind of there and then habit, and part of that habit is important because you have to learn the practice, or you have to learn something. And so much of our work in this 4 days has also been about undoing. Well, there's always, it's not just here, but there's a big movement at the moment about undoing, or trying to be in the here and now as a whole person, as a dancer. Because I think, for me, my history is that dancers meet and they work together, but they're not actually really always with each other. They're not actually in the here and now of attending to each other. They're working through the codes of dance, and that's how they meet. So, and I may be completely wrong here, but that's my kind of feeling around a lot of dance that I see, and I think it's so interesting to try and, what I think we're doing here is to try and be in the here and now with each other, which means undoing as well as bringing history.
So do you not think even verbal conversations work the same way as in that we exist within codified ways of approaching each other, yes. And we meet each other and we say, hi, how are you? And you say, hi, I'm fine, thank you. How are you? It's
so right now, where is this attention? Where this attention right now? Yeah. How can we be really here in this moment of meeting each other while using this language that's
yeah. And I guess on the one hand, it's not necessarily a bad thing, but those codes are a kind of requirement, as you say, for kind of connection and
necessary
communication and so on. But I guess it's the speed at which our attempts to scramble the codes, as Deleuze would put it, kind of re-sediment back into other codes that can be the kind of frustrating part. So that, for instance, I mean, obviously, all of you in this room will know more about this than I do, but about in terms of dance codes that, if you're, you're dismantling the codes of ballet, the movement that you generate as the dismantling then becomes codified so quickly as okay, so here's the modern dance codes, and then the modern dance codes are dismantled by, oh, here's the postmodern dance codes, and that kind of constant process of, well, how do you produce something that is not recognizable as a code? Is that, you know, and as I've, you know, said with someone like Jonathan Crary, there are people who don't think that that's possible. But in order for the movement to be encountered at all, in order for it to enter our experience, it has to be an iteration of a code. Otherwise, it wouldn't count as experience. It wouldn't register with us at all.
So it's that tension between the uncertainty of the here and now and that there and then.
Yeah.
It's that I think is so exciting and trying to get that.
Yeah, yeah.
But they're together, the here and now and the there and then, all the time. I want to tell a thing that might be too pedestrian to tell. I'm going to tell it quickly.
I doubt it very much, Karen.
Tell it very quickly. I gave my attention was captured by a crowd of pigeons who were eating some, like, croutons or something, some pieces of bread that were crouton size, sort of like a dice or something. So they were pecking at them, and the piece of bread was white and flying into the air and coming back down somehow with this brutality of their pecking. So it was like, oh, and with all these white things. For some reason, I found it interesting enough to get my phone out and take a little video, which I did. And then later that day, completely separate from that incident, and in my mind not attached at all, I craved popcorn. And I don't eat popcorn very much. I mean, I probably hadn't eaten popcorn for 5 years. But I wanted popcorn so much, I went and got the kernels and made some popcorn and ate the popcorn and thought, yeah, I don't really like popcorn. And it wasn't until later I saw the video again, I realized, oh, it's like popcorn. But you know, this thing lodged in my brain, which was not a conscious development, but somehow it just happened. So it's kind of in response to you, Nick, and what you're saying about, I don't know, what emanates from what you've paid attention to during this time. I don't think we always know, but sometimes we can make the connections later. That's a really small version, because these things sometimes happen over years, yeah, where we make a connection back to something.
But I think that's what part of what Bergson is getting at when he's saying that that perception is already there. That it's not a matter of kind of looking further into the thing we're attending to somehow, but that there is a wider perception than consciousness allows, or that this kind of, at least his utilitarian kind of relative version of how ordinary consciousness works allows, so that, you know.
Right. So something was absorbed, but I wasn't conscious of what that was. Not that popcorn is so fantastical, but it's, you know, in the fact that it's so simple, it kind of makes it easier to see this weird line of things that can happen in your mind, unintended, well, based on this kind of focus, attention. Sorry, you were going to say.
No, it's also kind of where I would want to go towards the end of this paper about who the we is in this process as well. That you know, you could say that was some pigeon thinking, you know, the pigeon, that's a set of pigeons thinking through you. You know, when we're talking about the we, we're not talking about human subjects or animals only as objects of attention.
Yeah. Or maybe I already wanted popcorn, and that's why I looked at the pigeons.
but they forced your attention. It wasn't your conscious choice.
They helped me out.
Yeah. Wow. Animal-oriented diet.
Maybe you could smell popcorn if you were.
wondered about the sort of same point that Karen's making, but relative to maybe like I missed a tiny bit. So I'm sorry. So when you were talking about, so I was thinking when Nikki was talking about what is yet to come, so the processing that will happen, and then in a week you'll go, yeah. So this was also my thought, and then also sometimes the act of reading, which could be like I'd be reading anything, I found seems to help me process like some other stuff. So if I'm too like caught up in something, let's say, I'm trying to figure something out, I put that down and then I'll go and read, and it's not an expectancy that suddenly I will finish reading a section and then everything will be clear, but it's almost as though that the act of reading is a distraction, or doing this other thing, if you like. Reading is particularly effective for me, is like a distraction, but it allows you to then pull focus. And it's like this is what's going on the surface, and then there's this other stuff that's going on, and about how distraction and attention kind of are existing together. So it's not a proper question, but I was wondering more about what you said about attention and what you were saying about distraction.
Yeah. So in the kind of Nicholas Carr informational kind of paradigm I was talking about, so even though there is this very kind of whatever negative account of the internet, that he does give some credence to a kind of value of interruption, or what you're calling distraction. But and as anyone who has writing block will know, that there's that way in which a kind of over attention can kind of do the precise opposite of what you're intending it to do. It fails to deliver, and the interruption is the release that gets the flow of thinking going again. That you kind of and that at that point the switching costs, as he calls them, are kind of have a positive value. So it's not like it's a completely kind of negative account. And then in the Jonathan Crary stuff, as I was saying, his attempt is to try and think attention and distraction together, so that he's interested in those kind of tipping points where experiences of attention might turn into their seeming opposites of inattention. So forms of kind of aesthetic contemplation, the kind of ideal deep, profound engagement with the work of art becomes a kind of trance, or kind of absorption that becomes problematic. So they're not these binaries, but they can shuttle into each other. I've just been talking about procrastination with Karen and how it manifests itself in different forms. She's baking bread, my husband cleans the car. There are various forms of how it manifests itself, these strange forms of activity we do in order to not do something else.
We have time maybe for one or two quick questions. I know Eva has one.
It's not really a question.
Yeah.
It's more, I had a really strong feeling when there was one point when you were talking about performance as a counter form of attention, that you put words on something that I've been working with for a long time as a curator, and trying to find ways to actually draw attention, hold visibility, whether it's in a theatre or in a festival or in a context, to forms of attention which were really actually quite subversive forms of attention. So that was really a moment that really captured in language something that I thought, oh yeah, this is why it's actually so hard to then work through the processes of theatre institutions to actually then normalise and find language to actually talk about those performances in ways which they're not naturally attuned to. So it was just an observation in regards what does it mean to then put those things in a theatre? Yes, or in a context where they meet people.
Yeah, but I think that's a way of thinking about the work that Goat Island did. That there's a real subversiveness about that slowness, of both of development and of the performance work. But and maybe now it's become more acceptable that we've kind of tuned as audiences to degrees of, well, some maybe in this room, I certainly felt like over the period of time I was watching Goat Island, I got more used to the durational demands of the work. But when it started, I think there was something deeply subversive about that. No, we're going to take this amount of time to do R&D. No, we're going to take this amount of time to do a show. And so I guess it's about identifying what the dominant organizational structures are of duration, let's say now. And
I think I was probably pointing towards how then that it gets translated in an institutional form when Goat Island comes to Nottingham and not dance, and that I as a curator write a text and try to get the city to come to see it. That's what I was actually practically putting the finger on.
Yeah.
And we probably don't have time to talk about that, but that's the bit that really caught my attention.
We'll wrap this up by the artists, and you're all welcome to join us in this. We'll start returning the building to how it was before we started, and then we'll move downstairs to the front room for drinks and being together for a few more hours. So thank you very much, Laura. Thanks for having me.